So we all watched in shock last week as Trump took the stage at the UN 80th General Assembly meeting in New York and basically just like berated world leaders and the UN in general for being like an inefficient waste of money. And it was just shocking for us to see because there's so much going on in the world with like wars raging on in Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan, and the UN dealing with billions of dollars of budget cuts and even like authoritarianism on the rise around the world. We just kind of were left after looking at all the meetings. What do all these like fancy speeches and meetings actually lead to? Like, what is the point of the UN in today's world?
So we're speaking to Maya Ungar from the Crisis Group to break down what is the purpose of the UN. And she recaps what happened last week with Trump, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, the budget cuts, the upcoming Secretary General election, and way more.
Trump obviously gave his UN speech last week, and everyone was pretty shocked by how like harshly he was criticizing not only world leaders but the UN itself. So what kind of impact do you think a speech like that has on the UN and just kind of its reputation around the world?
I mean, he told world leaders that their countries were all going to hell. That was one of the remarks that really stuck with me the most. So I think in that relative sense, people were not as upset as they could have been about the remarks that came out from President Trump. Like, I didn't see it as a worst case scenario speech for the institution. He said some very harsh remarks, particularly on migration, the way in which he kind of accused the UN of allegedly funding and creating an invasion against the US's southern border. But in other aspects, he actually mentioned one area where he felt like the UN would be able to play a positive or a constructive role and seemed to call for the UN to be engaging more heavily with him, instead of just saying this is a demise of the institution.
Trump has been so critical of the UN and has called it a waste of money, obviously cutting the budget and everything.
Mhm.
Is there a chance that the UN headquarters could be moved out of the US?
So I think that the headquarters will stay, particularly the functions as they relate to peace and security. But I do think a lot of elements will be moved out of the US. This past month, for example, UN Women announced that they would be moving about 35% of their staff that are currently based in New York to Bonn in Germany and to Nairobi in Kenya. And so we're expecting to see further movements in the future. Nairobi, Bonn, Seville in Spain, Bangkok, Istanbul, Bogota, these are different headquarters that the UN already has an existing presence in that we've been hearing discussed for movements of the institution.
We do understand that the US is no longer really the nation that is like leading the UN or like sitting at the helm. And there seems to be a bit of like a power vacuum. So we wanted to ask you, who do you think will maybe step up to fill the role? Because we've heard some whisperings of like maybe China wanting to get more involved, which was surprising.
I think in some areas we're absolutely seeing China taking on a greater role. I think one area is climate. It was really telling to see Trump had his big speech really shutting down elements of green energy. And then the next day, Xi Jinping made a surprise appearance at a climate-related event at the sidelines of UN High Level Week and announcing all these commitments on green energy. But at the same time, China is going to invest in a very targeted strategic way for them. They traditionally were the most stringent against increases in UN financing of any member state. I think that other interesting players like the Gulf countries are going to be someone to watch. We've seen the Gulf countries take on a pretty significant role as middle powers in mediation, and they've been looking to kind of expand their influence.
So obviously, the Israel-Palestine conflict took center stage last week. The UN Commission, we thought this was interesting, itself conducted an investigation and declared just a few weeks ago that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and yet Netanyahu spoke at the UN as the Israeli military was actively taking over Gaza City. And so we're kind of left wondering, like, what can the UN even do at this point?
It's a really important critique, and I think one that many have been voicing over the past week and honestly months since October 7th. Last week, the more important part was actually the behind-the-scenes discussions, a select group, for example, of Arab leaders and Donald Trump to discuss what's happening in Gaza. And I think that actually the UN as a platform for these behind-the-scenes dialogue, which is something that the majority of us don't get a chance to see, is where a lot of the real action and utility of the UN as a convening space and platform rests for it here in New York. On the second front, the UN really is the only entity that is capable of providing the amount of humanitarian aid and assistance necessary to provide for the situation in Gaza, people starving, people without shelter. So this does raise that existential question of Security Council reform and the idea of how effective can an institution be when you have five members who are able to stop the will of potentially 192 others. If we don't have the UN, if we don't have this rules-based order anymore, it's not just that we won't be able to have as many meetings here in New York, right? It's that less people are going to get food, less people are going to get vaccinated, smaller countries are no longer going to have a court system to be able to bring broad issues to,
Another topic we wanted to get your take on that we know there's a lot of attention on was Russia. The foreign minister said that Russia has no intention of provoking NATO countries and only that it would fight back against aggression, even though they're also the ones who have been performing these flyovers with drones and even fighter jets to at least four NATO countries. What was the response to these remarks? Like, if that's the case, then what are they trying to prove of these flyovers?
To be frank, I don't think the Europeans really believed at all the Russian statements here. There's a few different theories of what the implications of this are. One is to try to intimidate forces away from this kind of cohesive coalition of the willing, providing troops, weapons, and support essentially, potentially to Ukraine. I had a discussion with a Baltic state last week who said, us investing in Ukraine is investing in our own national security, in our own national defense. It's cheaper to do that than it is to fight a war ourselves. So I think depending on how far people are away from the Russian border, that changes the way and how impactful that is. I think there's also a bit of a testing of the red lines of NATO, and a testing of what the US response will be. Russia does a really good job of completely redrawing the red lines, is they'll push inches and inches and inches forward to the point where all of a sudden things that previously were the middle compromise ground are now the absolute red lines for them.
We have heard that there might be a scaling back of human rights investigations to save money, and that's being pushed by countries like Iran, China, and Russia. And that really shocked us. Like, what are experts saying about this?
Yeah, the budget crisis is absolutely existential for the organization. For those of us who spend our waking days, unfortunately, just thinking about the United Nations, like this is the absolute thing top of mind. So there are two main reasons why we are in such a bad liquidity crisis right now. The first is that member states have not been paying their dues in full, and the second is that they have not been paying them on time. The real two big perpetrators of this are the US and China, simply because they together make up almost half of the entire budget of the United Nations. The US is really, really bad about paying their budget to the United Nations. What's really interesting is this actually stems from Ronald Reagan, where Reagan made a campaign promise that he said he wanted to cut X amount of money from the US budget. But the UN budget cycle and the US budget cycle are different. And so he just delayed payment until October. He was able to say he like fulfilled this campaign promise, saving, X amount of dollars for the US economy. Every president since have had to keep to that schedule. Otherwise, it would look like to taxpayers that they're increasing this $1 billion plus. And what was happening previously wasn't sustainable. It's not just President Trump's fault, but he has significantly exacerbated the speed of it, which is why the Secretary General has introduced this reform.
And we know that this current Secretary General, his term will be up the end of next year. There's obviously going to be a lot of weight on the shoulders of whoever is next. Could you tell us what the process is to elect a new Secretary General?
Yeah, so great question, because this is really last week is when things started heating up. You've seen a few names starting to come out. The way that a Secretary General election works is that typically it is supposed to switch between regions. So this is supposed to be Latin America's turn to have a Secretary General. There has been a huge push that it should be a woman, as the Secretary General has never been a woman. Now, the rhetoric on this changed a lot when Trump came into office. All of a sudden, the US is pushing back significantly, saying, gender shouldn't be a determining factor. But there's about 5 or 6 candidates that have been really making their names known. Usually, Secretary Generals previously were high-level politicians in another life. Some of the other candidates that we're hearing, Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile. You have Rebecca Greenspan from Costa Rica. You have Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the former foreign minister of Ecuador. You have Rafael Grossi from Argentina, who is the main male candidate in the race right now, and I would say has the most momentum of any candidate.
For our last question, what are some of the big picture patterns you think we'll see? Like, the US is taking a step back. Do we think other countries will do the same? Like this new Secretary General? Like,
it's a really interesting question. I think one immediate pattern is that you're going to see a lot more targeted investment in the UN versus the kind of core or broad support that you previously saw from member states. If you're a European country, you're contributing more to your national security, looking towards Ukraine. You're going to see member states who provide a lot more earmarked funds, which is going to mean that you're going to have very certain kind of areas of interest for member states prioritized over what the organization strategically thinks is best. I think on the second, you're going to have a secretary general who is trying to keep the organization afloat. Personality does matter here. I think that's something we've really learned with the Trump administration in particular, is that these world leaders in so much of global politics, a lot of that is personality politics. And so the new SG is a chance for the UN to kind of reinvent itself to a limited respect in some ways. There's a quote that always has really resonated with me, which was from Dag Hammarskjöld, one of the early secretary generals, who said, the UN was not created to bring us to heaven. It was created to try to save us from hell. Because the reality is that if the UN is not there, a lot of the time, no one is.